The old car had been sitting untouched for 17 years, hidden beneath a dusty canvas in the far corner of a massive private garage. To everyone else, it was nothing more than a rusting machine that had lost its value long ago. But to wealthy heiress Eloane Voss, it was the last thing in the world that still belonged to her father. And when she finally uncovered it that bright Saturday morning, she made a decision that would change the lives of two completely different families. She would find someone who could restore the car exactly as her father had loved it. What she didn't know was that the man she would hire wasn't a famous restoration expert or a wealthy collector. He was a struggling single dad who worked from a tiny neighborhood garage, counted every dollar twice, and carried a quiet grief of his own. Before we begin, if you believe that kindness can give people a second chance and that sometimes the smallest act can change an entire life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Little Kindness Tales. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you. Eloane stood beneath the bright afternoon sunlight as the garage doors opened slowly. Dust floated through the air, revealing the shape of a 1967 silver blue Grand Touring coupe. Its chrome was dull, its tires were flat, and several years of neglect had left the paint faded. Yet Eloane could still remember sitting in that passenger seat as a little girl while her father drove her through the countryside every Sunday morning. Her father, August Voss, had been one of the most successful businessmen in the country, but when he was behind the wheel of that car, he had never seemed like a billionaire. He was simply her father. He would stop for roadside fruit, tell terrible jokes, and let Eloane choose the music. Those ordinary moments had become more valuable than everything her father had left behind. August had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving Eloane a fortune, several companies, and a huge mansion that often felt strangely empty. She had spent years avoiding the garage because she couldn't bear to touch the things that reminded her of him. But that morning, she finally decided she was ready. Her estate manager recommended several expensive restoration companies, but Eloane rejected every proposal. Each company talked about increasing the car's market value, replacing original parts, and turning it into a collector's masterpiece. None of them understood what she wanted. She didn't want the most expensive restoration. She wanted her father's car back. That was how she found Matteo Calder, a 38-year-old single father who operated a small restoration garage on the edge of town. Matteo had learned mechanics from his grandfather and spent nearly 15 years restoring old vehicles. His garage was modest, with peeling paint, 2 lifts, a small office, and shelves filled with carefully labeled tools. His 9-year-old daughter, Mira, often sat at a little desk near the window doing homework while her father worked. Matteo's life had become a constant balancing act. Every morning he prepared Mira's breakfast, walked her to school when his schedule allowed, opened the garage, worked until late afternoon, picked her up, helped with homework, prepared dinner, and then returned to the garage after she went to sleep. He wasn't wealthy, but he had built a reputation for honest work. If a part could be repaired instead of replaced, he repaired it. If a customer couldn't afford something unnecessary, he told them not to waste their money. When Eloane arrived at his garage in a sleek black vehicle, Matteo initially assumed she was simply another wealthy customer looking for an expensive restoration. But when she showed him photographs of the old coupe, his expression changed immediately. He didn't ask how much money she was willing to spend. Instead, he asked about the car's history. He wanted to know who drove it, where it had been stored, what modifications had been made, and whether she had any photographs of her father with it. Eloane was surprised. She opened her phone and showed him an old photograph of August standing beside the car while holding a small Eloane's hand. Matteo studied the photograph carefully. Then he noticed something most people would have ignored. The driver's seat had been adjusted unusually far forward. Eloane explained that her father had moved it forward because she used to sit beside him as a child and wanted to see over the dashboard. Matteo smiled quietly and told her that detail mattered. He said that restoring the car wasn't only about making it look new. It was about preserving the evidence of the life it had lived. Eloane hired him that day. The restoration quickly became far more difficult than either expected. The engine required extensive work. The original upholstery had deteriorated. Several parts were almost impossible to locate, and the electrical system had been modified decades earlier. Matteo spent hours researching old manuals and contacting collectors. But he refused to take shortcuts. Weeks passed. Eloane visited the garage regularly, sometimes bringing old photographs and sometimes simply watching from the doorway. She began noticing things she had never known about Matteo. He always kept a small lunch container beside his tools because he couldn't afford to leave the garage for expensive meals. He kept a photograph of Mira near his workbench. And whenever Mira came home from school, Matteo stopped whatever he was doing for a few minutes to hear about her day. One afternoon, Eloane watched as Mira entered the garage carrying a school project. She immediately ran to her father and proudly showed him a small cardboard model of a car she had built. Matteo wiped his hands, sat beside her, and listened carefully while she explained every detail. Eloane stood quietly nearby. She had inherited billions, yet she couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her with that kind of simple attention. Something inside her began to change. Meanwhile, Matteo was facing a serious problem. The original engine component needed for the restoration was no longer manufactured. A replacement could be built, but it would cost thousands of dollars. Matteo knew Eloane could easily afford it, but he also knew that replacing the part would make the restoration less authentic. He spent days searching. One afternoon, while going through an old storage catalog, he discovered a retired mechanic named Silas Rowe who had once worked on the exact model of car. Silas lived several hours away and had spent years collecting original components. Matteo called him and explained the situation. Silas agreed to help. The next morning, Matteo drove out before sunrise, leaving Mira with a trusted neighbor. He returned late that afternoon carrying the rare component wrapped carefully in an old blanket. But there was another problem. Matteo had missed several hours of work that day, and one of his regular customers canceled a major repair. Money was getting tighter. His landlord had already warned him about overdue rent on the garage. That evening, Mira noticed her father sitting silently at the kitchen table. She asked him what was wrong. Matteo smiled and told her everything would be fine. He didn't tell her that he had been considering selling his grandfather's old toolbox, the one valuable possession he had kept since childhood, to cover the garage expenses. The next morning, Eloane arrived unexpectedly. She found Matteo repairing the car while Mira worked on homework nearby. Eloane noticed the old toolbox immediately. She remembered seeing it in the garage for years, but this time she saw a small handwritten name engraved beneath the handle. Matteo explained that it had belonged to his grandfather. Eloane asked why he looked worried. Matteo hesitated, then admitted that the garage was struggling financially. He said he wasn't asking for more money and would never use her project to solve his personal problems. He simply wanted to finish the restoration properly. That answer stayed with Eloane. She had spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Matteo was the first person in years who seemed determined not to take anything. Several more weeks passed. Finally, on a clear afternoon, Matteo rolled the restored car outside. The silver-blue paint reflected the daylight. The chrome gleamed. The original interior had been carefully repaired rather than replaced. The engine sounded smooth and steady. Eloane walked toward it slowly. She ran her fingers across the driver's door. Then Matteo handed her something. It was a small metal plate he had discovered hidden beneath the old dashboard. It contained a handwritten message from her father. Eloane stared at it in disbelief. Matteo explained that he had found the message while removing the dashboard and had carefully preserved it. The message wasn't about money, business, or inheritance. It was a simple note August had apparently written for Eloane years earlier. It reminded her that possessions were never meant to replace people, and that the most valuable things in life were the moments shared with those we loved. Eloane's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the restored car, then at Mateo. But Mateo wasn't finished. He opened the trunk. Inside was a small wooden picnic box. Eloane recognized it immediately. Her father had carried that same box on their Sunday drives. Mateo had repaired it too. Eloane covered her mouth, overwhelmed. She realized that Mateo hadn't simply restored a car. He had restored a piece of her childhood. But then Mateo did something that left her completely speechless. He handed her the keys and told her the restoration was finished. Eloane asked him how much she owed. Mateo gave her the final invoice. She looked at it and immediately realized something was missing. The amount was significantly lower than what the restoration had actually cost. She asked why. Mateo explained that he had found several original parts through personal contacts and had reduced his labor charge because he believed the car meant more to her than it could ever be worth financially. Eloane looked at him and said she couldn't accept that. Mateo simply replied that sometimes people needed something meaningful more than they needed extra money. That was the moment Eloane made her own decision. She didn't hand Mateo a huge check. Instead, she asked him to bring Mira to the estate the following weekend. On Saturday afternoon, Mateo and Mira arrived at Eloane's property. Eloane led them to a newly renovated building beside the estate. Inside was a fully equipped restoration workshop. Mateo stared in disbelief. Eloane explained that she had purchased the building and arranged everything under one condition: Mateo would run it exactly as he ran his small garage, honestly, carefully, and with opportunities for young mechanics who couldn't afford expensive training. She told him it wasn't charity. It was a partnership. She wanted her father's legacy to become something that helped other people build futures instead of simply sitting inside a locked garage. Mateo was speechless. Mira looked around the workshop with wide eyes and asked whether she could have a little desk there for her homework. Everyone laughed. Months later, the workshop became one of the most respected restoration businesses in the region. Mateo kept working with the same patience and honesty. Mira grew up surrounded by tools, engines, books, and people who taught her that success wasn't measured by the size of a bank account. And every Sunday afternoon, Eloane drove her father's restored car to the countryside. Sometimes Mateo and Mira joined her. They would stop beside a quiet field, open the old picnic box, and share lunch beneath the afternoon sky. For Eloane, the car no longer represented the loss of her father. It represented everything he had taught her. For Mateo, the restoration had saved more than an automobile. It had given his daughter a secure future. And for Mira, it became the beginning of a dream she hadn't even known she could have. Years later, when people asked Eloane why she had invested so much into a small restoration shop, she always gave the same answer. She said that her father left her a fortune, but a struggling single dad reminded her what that fortune was actually supposed to mean. Not luxury. Not status. Not possessions. But opportunity. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves behind. It's what you choose to do with it. And sometimes, a person enters your life simply to restore something you thought was broken forever. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Little Kindness Tales. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a little hope today. And before we end, here's a special request. Comment, "Kindness can restore," if you believe one act of kindness can change more than one life. Because Eloane thought she was hiring a mechanic to restore her father's classic car. She never expected him to restore something far more important. Her faith in people. And Mateo never expected that fixing an old car would give his daughter a future he had once believed was beyond his reach. The car kept driving for many years after that. But its greatest journey had already happened. It had brought two families together and proved that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't found in expensive garages, massive estates, or inherited fortunes. They are found in kindness, honesty, sacrifice, and the courage to give someone a second chance.